Hello. In this video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the concept of strategy, and then we'll take it specifically to applying it to your firms that you're developing. So in the last video, Professor Conger talked about 4 ways of thinking about strategy, and we're really going to dive deeper into 2 of them. We'll talk more about the RBV, and we'll talk about the industrial organization or Porter's 5 forces kind of a view of strategy. Just a review, strategy is ultimately concerned with sustainable competitive advantage. In other words, why do some firms outperform other firms? Why is it that some teams outperform other teams? What is it that would make it such that we have some companies consistently outperform other companies over time? Why doesn't competition get rid of those advantages? One note I want to make before we dive into the nuts and bolts of this is that strategy is at a deep level about trade-offs. It's about figuring out what you will do, but it's also figuring out what you won't do. And so when thinking about your strategic position, you want to perform different activities, the same activities in a different way. You need to align your activities, capabilities, and competencies. So as Professor Conger discussed, there's sort of this big picture, and strategy is this overall framework for how it is that you're going to operate your firm. Now let's jump in with a story. So, fictional story here, but let's assume that one day I get tired of being a professor. I think, what'd be really great is running a hot dog stand. And so right outside the building on the corner of High and Patterson, I put up my hot dog stand, and there I am, and I've got hot dogs and looks like ice cold lemonade. Maybe I charge more than 5 cents a glass. In fact, I find out there's this huge unmet demand for hot dogs just right there, and people are starving as they come out of FSB, and they start buying my hot dogs like crazy, and I'm able to charge $10 a hot dog. And so, I buy my hot dogs at Kroger. The buns at Kroger, the lemonade, everything I get at Kroger, I come down, I set up, and then I sell them for $10. Well, what's going to happen if that's the first day? What's going to happen on the second day? Probably I'm going to have some competition. Some of you clever FSB students are going to say, what, you can make $10 per hot dog and sell out in an hour, and and with 2 hours of work, you made $10,000. Oh my gosh. And so there's going to be some competition. But the competition says, hey, I want you to come to me. I'm the new guy on the corner. I'm selling my hot dogs for $9 a hot dog. And this goes pretty well. I have to lower my prices to compete, but we end up, we both make a huge profit on day 2. Well, by day 3, everybody else has figured this out. Pretty soon there's a ton of competition, and all those supernormal profits that I was earning on day 1 are just gone. They're wiped out by competition. Everybody else can also go to Kroger. Everybody else can also buy hot dogs. Everybody else can also get a little hot dog stand. And so pretty soon I'm back to making an average of, $7-8 an hour through my efforts. And at that point, no new competition enters because they look at it and they say, for earning $7-8 an hour, there's something else I'd rather be doing. It's not worth it to me to set up a hot dog cart. And so all those supernormal profits get competed away. And that's sort of what we expect in Economics 101, right? When demand is high, the supply will expand to meet the demand until you hit some sort of market equilibrium. And at that point, people say, no, it's not worth jumping into this business. So strategy is all about asking the question, why doesn't this happen every single time? Why aren't profits always competed away by competition? Here's the hot dogs. My kids are big fans of the show How It's Made. And if you never want to eat a hot dog again, I'm suggesting watching the episode on how hot dogs are made. I think you can find it on YouTube. It's pretty gross. But what if instead of going to Kroger, instead I use my grandmother's secret recipe? It's been passed down from her grandmother and her grandmother before, and you know what? We grow our own hogs, and we feed them certain special secret things, and then we butcher them ourselves, and smoke them ourselves and process them ourselves, and but in fact nobody else in the whole world knows this recipe, and it makes the best tasting hot dogs ever. So you can imagine a scenario now where I set up my hot dog cart on the corner of High and Patterson. I find out there is indeed a demand for hot dogs. But instead of just picking up my hot dogs at Kroger, I use this secret special knowledge and ability to make the best tasting hot dogs ever. And I charge $10 a hot dog. Now, the competition still might come. They might come and say, wow, he's charging $10 a hot dog. What can we do? And if the competition is buying their hot dogs from Kroger and people are like, yeah, these are okay, but I'm willing to pay, $1 or $2 for a Kroger hot dog versus $10 for Professor Sutter's secret recipe, right? In that case, I'm able to preserve my competitive advantage. I'm able to sustain it. It doesn't get competed away in the same extent. Because there's something unique and different that can't be copied by the competition. So we can think about competitive advantage from an internal perspective. And when we do this, we want to think about resources. And in this case, the secret recipe and the knowledge and skills that I have about making hot dogs, those were a resource that other firms didn't have, right? And so we can ask 4 questions about this resource. Number 1, we ask, is it valuable? Is it rare? Is it imitable? Can you copy it? And are you organized to exploit it? And these are the things that Professor Conger discussed in the last video, but I wanted to illustrate it with that concrete hot dog example and say, okay, does my secret recipe check those boxes? Is it valuable? Yes. Is it rare? It is. Can it be imitated? No, apparently not. And am I organized to exploit it? Yeah, I've set up my hot dog stand and I'm there on the corner. So what you've got to think about then is, what is the key resource that you can control that can't be copied? Is it your brand? Is it the relationship that you have with your customer? Is it the knowledge of a certain process? Is it some sort of patented technology? Is it your quality? You want to think really hard about the resources that you're developing in your venture, and what would make them difficult to copy, right? So that's the key question you've got to be able to answer for unfair advantage, is to say, okay, why would your firm have an advantage over other firms, and why would it be difficult for other firms to copy what you do? And often the answer comes back to what the resources or the capabilities that you have. Now, it's pretty easy to say, oh, yes, this could never be copied. I mean, it's easy to make claims, right? I love the movie Elf, and he jumps in and he sees a sign on the sidewalk that says, world's best cup of coffee, and just walks into this horrible looking little coffee shop, and he's just so excited for them. He starts screaming, "You did it! Congratulations! World best cup of coffee! Great job, everybody! It's great to meet you." So just because you say that you've got a critical resource doesn't mean that you actually have it, right? So your task as you're building your venture is to actually develop those skills and capabilities that are difficult to copy. And if you've got technology, if you have some sort of brand, if you have a relationship, there's all these valuable resources that you can control. If you develop in a way that they can't be copied, and they are valuable and they are rare, they're difficult to imitate, and you're organized well, then you'll have that sustainable advantage. You'll have the unfair advantage over your competition. Now we can imagine another scenario. Let's pretend that I've got my hot dog cart, and but instead of setting up on the street corner, I set up on the campus of Ohio State. And indeed, there are at least 2 hot dog vendors on Ohio State's campus. And they're selling hot dogs for like $6 each. And there's nothing special about these hot dogs. I mean, they're fine. I don't know if they get them at Kroger, but there's some grocery store, right? Some supplier. They're selling for $6 each. And yet there's not a whole bunch of competition. And you might ask, well, what's going on? Why, selling hot dogs for $6 a piece is pretty good money. Why is there not more competition? You might ask the same question about hot dog vendors on the streets of Chicago or in New York City. There's long lines. They're selling them for high prices. Why don't we see a whole bunch of hot dog vendors springing up there? And it turns out that there is something else going on. In this case, we have to know something about the industry, the external environment. So we're going to think about this from the external perspective now, Porter's 5 forces. And there's 2 key pieces of intuition: more competitors equals lower profits, or conversely, fewer competitors equals higher profits, and lower bargaining power equals lower profits, or conversely, again, higher bargaining power equals higher profits. So with Porter's 5 forces, we ask about 5 things. We ask about the threat of suppliers. We ask about the threat of buyers. We think about the threat of substitutes. We think about the threat of entry or barriers to entry. We think about the threat of rivalry. And all of these things will determine the profitability of a specific firm. Let me jump straight to the hot dog example. At Ohio State and in New York City and elsewhere, there's a barrier to entry. You have to have a license to sell hot dogs on the Ohio State campus, and they don't grant unlimited numbers of licenses. In fact, they grant 2. And the same would be true of desirable locations in New York City or Chicago or other big cities that might have vendors. And so that's one external condition. It's in this case, a barrier to entry or regulation that stops competition from springing up and changes how profitable a given venture is. But it's not the only one. So there's other things that might characterize, kind of move my video over, might characterize the industry that would influence the profitability of firms. So one question is the threat of suppliers. Big, powerful suppliers are bad for your business. Small, weak, fragmented suppliers are good for your business. So let's say that you've got a company that makes cars and you make them out of vibranium. Rest in peace, Chad Boseman. We've lost a wonderful actor and from all accounts a good human being. But if you've seen Black Panther, you'll know that they control like all the vibranium in the world, right? Fictional metal. And you can imagine if you made products out of vibranium, your supplier would have huge leverage. Like Wakanda could essentially dictate the price, they could dictate the availability, they could dictate the conditions. You would have to do whatever they said in order to access, the vibranium that you needed for your product. On the other hand, if you make something out of aluminum, your suppliers are fairly small, fairly fragmented. There's lots of places you can buy aluminum. It's not super rare. And so you're likely to be more profitable when you're making products out of aluminum than you are if you're making them out of vibranium, in the sense, at least from the perspective of your suppliers, right? Because your suppliers of aluminum have relatively little control over the prices they can charge you. Suppliers of vibranium can essentially extract all of the profits in the price that they charge for vibranium. So if you're a startup, you've got to ask, what are the inputs? What are the what suppliers am I going to have to work with? How powerful are those suppliers, or how fragmented? How is this going to influence my ultimate profitability? I can think about buyers as well. Same logic here. Big, powerful buyers are bad for my business. Fragmented, weak buyers with few other options are good for my business. So if I sell to Walmart, if I'm a producer and I sell to Walmart, well, I produce cheap plastic stuff and I sell it to Walmart. My buyer is very, very, very powerful. Walmart can essentially dictate the terms directly to me and tell me exactly what I have to do and how much they're willing to pay and everything else. But if I'm selling to a whole bunch of fragmented buyers, and maybe there's lots of them, but they're not very cohesive, they don't coordinate together at all, I'm in a much stronger position, right? So we want to think about, if I'm in a startup, do I have to cater to a few very, very powerful buyers, or can I cater to a whole bunch of more fragmented buyers with few other options? And that's going to have implications for my profitability. The barriers to entry we talked about. So in New York City, to get a license to have a hot dog stand at the zoo, which is pretty much the most desirable location in New York City, $289,000 to put your hot dog cart up in the zoo. That's just one kind of barrier, right? But barriers to entry generally are factors that keep new competitors from entering the industry. So maybe larger scale economies make it more difficult. Like it would be pretty tough to jump into the airline manufacturing business, right? To compete with Boeing and Airbus, who are essentially the two big players in the commercial airline industry. Because they operate at such a massive scale, it'd be hard to get together the funding and the experience and everything else to jump into that industry. So, large capital requirements, massive economies of scale, limited access to distribution channels can make entry more difficult. It's hard to get into the soft drink industry in the United States, not because it's hard to build new soft drinks, but just because it's hard to get shelf space in grocery stores. And so that's a barrier to competition. And then, of course, certain regulations like requiring a license for a hot dog stand can make entry into a given industry more difficult. Threat of rivalry. This is a little confusing only because we use the term rivalry often to mean two competitors that go head to head. In this case, what it really refers to is how many players are in the current industry and how intense the competition is. So when there's slow industry growth, there's likely to be more rivalry. It's competitors arguing and fighting over a fixed pie. When there's more exit barriers, so if it's hard for me to get out of the business, then that's going to increase rivalry, because I'm just going to go ahead and compete where I am rather than transition to another line. More firms, the more companies there are in the same space means more rivalry. And a lack of product differentiation. If we're all pretty much selling the exact same thing, that makes competition more intense. And again, those things are going to lower my profits. And finally, a threat of substitutes. The extent that a customer's needs may be met in a different way. So direct substitution with the same functionality. So, or similar functionality, Netflix versus cable. More and more people are substituting cable for things like Netflix or Hulu or anything else. Or you're even eliminating the need for a product. Flip video cameras were massively popular for 3 days, and then cell phones with video cameras came out, right? So it's been a rough 100 years for the horse plowing industry because we've got really good substitutes now. People don't need to buy big, strong draft horses to plow their fields. They can buy tractors, right? And so when effective substitutes come out, that's going to lower the profitability of the firm. So when we think about our firms and when we think about unfair advantage, we want to think about both inside the firm, what resources or capabilities do I control that are difficult for other firms to copy? That's one way to think about it. And the other way is to think about my position within the industry. What's my relationship with my suppliers and buyers? What are some of the barriers to entry that could exist? What are what particular substitutes exist? What does the level of rivalry look like within the industry? And so I can think about these external factors and how that's going to influence my firm's profitability. So that's, again, going into a little more depth, hopefully with a few more examples on strategy and specifically the resource-based view and Porter's 5 forces. In the next video, we'll talk about what this means for you and how you can start to think about these things in relationship to the venture that you're developing.